I've reviewed the Amaran 60X, the 100X, and now it's time to review the 200X and the 200D. Hello, my name is Jonathan Poetry. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Please like and subscribe as always, as it massively helps me out. Now, as you can see today, I am in my living room rather than my office because I needed a bit more space to do this review of these lights and do some comparisons to other lights that I've got as well. Hopefully you'll find this very useful. As you've probably seen on my channel before, I absolutely love the Amaran lights. You know, the 60X is so small and compact, the 100X is great value for money, and now we've got the 200X here as well, which is just giving that extra boost of power. But where does the 200X and the 200D differ from the 100 series? And is it a real competitor to the more professional line such as the 300D? So let's first look at how these lights are similar and how they differ from the 100 series. And actually, at first signs, they look very, very similar. As you can see, they are identical size. They've used the same body for both these lights. There is a weight difference. I think there's extra kind of cooling inside these ones and bigger fan, and that does add to the weight, and it makes them feel a bit more solid actually. But other than that, they are identical, which is handy in terms of buying a kit and being able to put them in a case. Like the 100 series, it is an all plastic design, which, you know, may put some people off. And if that is a problem for you, then you've got to go for the Aputure series instead. But I think for a lot of people, this plastic is actually more than strong enough. I think if you're an owner operator of this kit, then I don't think you need to worry about the build quality of these lights. Like the 100 series, there is an umbrella holder there, and of course it is Bowens mount on the front. This is super useful. I really like the fact that they have included this. The lights do come with their own reflector. Frustratingly, it is the new hyper reflector, which I've actually got here on this 300D. I'm just using it across all the lights. It's not as good as the older one. It definitely creates more of a hot spot in the center and less even spread, which is kind of against what you really want when it comes to using a reflector on a light. It's fine if you're bouncing it, and that's what we'll be doing in the test actually. We'll be bouncing it off a wall, but if you want to use the light directly, then the older reflectors are better. Of course, being Bowens mount, you can use all of the different softboxes and other diffusers that Aputure and other brands have released. There's so many good options out there now. I absolutely love the Light Dome 2 because it just works and it looks great straight out of the box. But there are also very good cheap alternatives in different shapes, all from different manufacturers that you can easily pick up off Amazon. One thing that people really noticed when these lights came out and they compared it to the 100 series is the noise of the fan. And I have to say, I think they've probably improved it over time since those first ones came out. There is a noise difference. These are noisier than the 100 series. I mean, after all, they are a much more powerful light. It makes sense. But I wouldn't say they're too bad. You know, I have heard worse. In fact, right now, you might be hearing it in the background. There is a fan noise. It's not coming from these lights. It's actually coming from the 300D's power pack on the ground. And that is kicking out quite a bit of noise from its fan. Now, I know they've designed that one so that it's meant to be far away from the camera setup. But in reality, if you're in a small room like this, shooting a short film or doing a corporate video, which is often the case for these sorts of lights, then that is too noisy. Fortunately, I don't think the 200 series is as bad, and it's certainly usable even in a small space. Now, when it comes to the differences between the 200D and the 200X, well, it really just comes down to the fact that obviously the X is by color. If you look on the back, you can see you've got the controls to adjust the color temperature as well as the intensity, while on the 200D, you only have that intensity dial. There is one other difference comparing the 200 series and the 100 series, and actually that's the power pack that goes with the lights. On the 100 series, it's very compact. It's this nice small kind of unit here, while on the 200 series, it's a bit bigger. It's about twice the size, although slightly slimmer, oddly enough, compared to what you have with the 300D, which is a very large setup. These aren't too bad. Now, unfortunately, like the 100 series, you can't use these lights with a battery out of the box. You do have to buy a separate system for being able to do that, which maybe I'll buy one day, but personally, I haven't really felt the need to do so with these lights, particularly the 200 series. Because these are more powerful, wherever I'm going to use them, I'm expecting to have a power supply. I often say how I love lights that you can power off battery, just because they're so versatile, you can use them anywhere, it solves any issues with health and safety. But I think when you get into these sorts of powers, the batteries just don't last that long. That is the issue. It's great maybe if you need it very briefly for a quick interview, but then if that's the case, you're probably not going to be needing this level of power. For me, when you get into this sort of power, you probably may as well be plugging into mains, unless you're planning to do maybe an outdoor shoot in the middle of a forest or something, and you don't have a generator, in which case though you may want to go for something more rugged like the Aputure series. Another issue I know people had early on with these lights is with this piece actually cracking when you tighten and loosen it. They've put a piece of metal inside and that seems to have fixed the issue, because I've not had any problems with the build quality of these lights so far. So how do all these lights compare? After all, if you're trying to pick between each one of them, it's probably going to come down to the brightness at the end of the day, isn't it? That's ultimately what you want a light to do. And you expect that the more power, the brighter it's going to be. So with that in mind, I have put together this little test just with a shot of my living room, where I've gone through each light to compare the exposure and see what difference really each light makes. Now, I haven't done a sort of direct blast of the lights, partly because I didn't want to blind my cat. That's actually one reason why I didn't do it, but also because I don't feel it's like a real world use case. How often are you really going to be blasting a light into something? It's going to look ugly, so you're not going to do that. Reality is you're either going to put it through some sort of diffusion or you're going to bounce it off something. So in this case, I've bounced it off the ceiling with all these scenes, and actually how I'm shooting right now, everything is being just bounced off white walls. Now straight away when I set this up, the first thing I actually noticed on a practical difference between the Aputure light and the Amaran series is the fact that actually the Amarans can point straight up, and this could be really useful in certain cases, especially if you're using something like a lantern, for example, as it could light up the whole room 360 degrees. With the 300D, you can't actually point it up directly, and in certain cases that may be quite annoying. In terms of setting the exposure, I actually started off with the 300D. I expected that one to be the brightest one, so I thought it makes sense that we set that as our exposure for the room. Now I wanted to keep the exposure of the outside in as well, so I used the false color built into the Canon C70 to make sure the outside wall wasn't overexposed. Now today was a grey, cloudy day here in the UK, as common as always, but there were some little holes in the cloud here and there, which was quite annoying actually. I was expecting it to be more consistent than that. So that does mean there may be some slight variations to the ambient light coming through, or the light that you're seeing outside of the room. This, however, is a real-world test. If I wanted to do perfect comparisons, of course I could, block off all the light in the room and we could use a light meter and we could measure it exactly. But what does that mean? And that's the problem I find with those sort of tests. It's very hard to gauge what that actually means. For me, what I thought would make more sense is to see how well do these lights light up a room generally. After all, if you're going for the more powerful lights, it's probably more than just an interview, it is actually probably to light up a space. So with that in mind, here is our first shot, and this is the control shot, so this had no lighting on at all, this is just the ambient light. Of course, it shows off how amazing the dynamic range of the C70 is. Already this actually looks pretty decent. My living room isn't the brightest of living rooms, this is just the ambient light coming through the window that is currently lighting up this space. Now we move on to the Aputure 300D, and I definitely expected this one to be the brightest light, so that's why I started with this first and made sure the exposure looked decent here. And it looks good, it's lit up the room really nicely. I think there's a pretty good balance of the exposure across the entire space. Certainly if you're just wanting to kind of have a very even soft light bounced off the ceiling, this is a really quick and good solution. Now this is where it gets really interesting, moving over to the 200D, and it seems like it's maybe ever so slightly brighter. Now it could be the ambient light has changed outside. In fact, I think it looks like it's got slightly darker outside when looking at this. And when you look into the corners, it definitely looks brighter in the 200D shot compared to the 300D. Now this is where I thought I'd see a bigger difference in the exposure, moving across from a dedicated daylight light through to a bicolor light. After all, you're splitting your LEDs between two colors, so how can the daylight of the 200X be anywhere near as close as the 200D? To my surprise actually though, the difference was really quite slight. Yes, I think it is a little bit darker, but there's not a huge difference at all. I really was expecting a much bigger difference between the two exposures right here. Finally, I chucked in the 100X, just to really show you the difference between the two different series. And I have to say, it's still pretty impressive. It's not as dark as I expected it to be. So we've got the same settings on the Canon C70, haven't changed any of them at all. And this is now what the exposure looks like with the 100X versus the 200X and the 200D. Of course, it is darker, but I think in a lot of cases, the 100X is going to be absolutely fine. If you're just doing interviews and don't expect to be kind of doing a big wide shot with your light, then I think the 100X will do more than good enough. The 200 series definitely has an extra kick, and personally, if you're going to pick between the two, either the X or the D, I'd probably go with the X. The extra flexibility of being able to shoot at different color temperatures is so handy, and it's such a useful feature to have in a light. I think it's worth having in any light you purchase from now on. And it really does seem like you're not taking too much of a hit. You're not losing half of your brightness by going to the bicolor light over the dedicated daylight light. With these results, is there even a need for the Aputure 300D anymore? Now, granted, this is the original 300D, it's not the Mark II, which I gather is actually somewhat brighter. So maybe, in that case, if you need to eke out that little bit extra brightness, then it's still worth going for the 300 series. That said, I think for most people, the difference isn't really worth the price. In fact, I probably would say it's worth picking up multiple 200Ds or 200Xs over going for one 300D. I think you'll get much more use out of that and much more flexibility. If you need maximum light, you could use both of those lights through diffusion or bouncing off something, and that is going to give you much more power than a single 300D ever would. Equally though, you can actually split it up and use them in different parts of the room, or use them as an accent light or a hair light. It just gives you more options having two lights over one for the same price. Of course, if you need the battery operation and extra build quality of the Aputure series, then that is the way to go. But for most people, as I mentioned before, I think the Amarans are a smart choice. I'd love to know what you think. Which ones would you be purchasing? In the future, I will be doing a comparison between the 200Ds and a 600D, which I think will be really interesting considering that massive price difference between the two. So if you like the sound of that, please make sure you subscribe to my channel. Please like this video because it does really help a lot. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.